Okay, folks, it's time for my long-awaited joint review of ISOM number 3 and the Great War of Separation number 2, where I cover how to keep peak shock value across multiple comics. This is going to be sort of an advanced class because it's not so much about warning you about the mistakes you might make within a comic, but rather about the mistakes you might make in having different comics of yours interact. So put your thinking caps on because this one goes deep. In my last ISOM number 3 review, Peak Unacceptable, I covered a scene where ISOM's mother, Harriet Silman, is attacked in her home by Darren Fontano's goons. She tries to get away from them, she struggles with them, but it's all to no avail, and she lets out a scream just as a goon is about to bring a chair down on her head. Harriet's husband and ISOM's father, Jacob Silman, is himself getting his ass beat by some of Darren Fontano's goons in the backyard when he hears Harriet cry out. He musters up a second wind of strength, but he's overcome before he can race to her aid. Consequently, down comes the chair with a force so hard the chair shatters, and Harriet appears too stunned to move, while the lead goon callously gloats over her. It turns out Harriet had been holding herself back the whole time. She's an accept, just like her son, and she's decided enough is enough and takes out Darren's goons with utmost ferocity. Elsewhere, her son Avery, also known as the hero Isom, is having a worse time of it, having discovered that his powers are on the fritz. It actually gets so bad that he becomes too weak even to stand up in the middle of a dire predicament, and he has to be rescued by one of Bloodroot's ghost dogs. Once all the players are out of danger, Avery and his mother sit down to have a chat about his powers and why they might be failing him. Avery says that he's never heard of an accept, or at least an accept like them, which is commonly called a peaker, losing his or her powers. What Harriet replies is all speculative, but what's interesting is all the things she doesn't say. She doesn't say, "It actually has happened before. Let me tell you the story." She also doesn't say, "It happened to me once. Let me tell you the story." She also doesn't say, "I've never lost my powers entirely, but I did get weaker once. Let me tell you the story." And she certainly doesn't say, "I still have my powers, but I feel them fading with age. Getting older sucks." In other words, Harriet doesn't say anything that indicates she or any other accept she's ever encountered has ever experienced a diminishing of powers after having manifested powers. And that means the whole time she was either trying to flee, trying to struggle, or screaming her lungs out, or even getting clobbered and humiliated, Harriet actually had her powers the whole time, and, what's more, knew she had them. She was aware she could have kicked Darren's goons' asses at any time, but she held herself back until the last moment. Why? We get part of the answer here in that it appears both Harriet and Avery have been concealing their powers from the rest of the family, which explains why Jacob freaks out hearing Harriet scream, as he doesn't know she has any powers to protect her. And it's a safe bet that if you don't want your own husband to know you have powers, you're also going to conceal the fact that you have powers from a bunch of criminals for as long as you can. But at some point, Harriet did say enough is enough and decide that it was time to reveal herself. What changed? My guess would be that once she knew her husband had been rendered incapable of coming to her rescue, she had no reason to worry about maintaining the charade of her normalcy in his presence, so she felt free to cut loose. Never mind that the comic gives no indicator anywhere of how she somehow became aware of her husband's having been restrained. Let's just go with the fact that she'd been maintaining a charade around him for so long that it was second nature to conceal her powers at first rather than reveal them. In fact, we can see an instance of the charade in the Great War of Separation number 1, where Harriet asks Jacob to open a fresh bottle of pickles for her. Obviously, she's play-acting weakness here, just like she was play-acting weakness in front of Darren's goons. And since we're mentioning the Great War of Separation, we may as well start in on this editor's note that appears during Harriet and Avery's heart-to-heart about his powers. From the position of the referencing asterisk in the dialogue, it would be reasonable to think that in the Great War of Separation number 2, we get an example of Harriet and Avery concealing their powers from Avery's father Jacob and his sister Altona. But that would be incorrect. That's because in the Great War of Separation number 1, Jacob is called up to join his fellow soldiers in the Texas Guard, and he has to leave his family behind. In the Great War of Separation number 2, we find he's still on duty, and in fact working closely with Texas Governor Plessy Sanders, so he never interacts with his family in this issue. And the only instance we see Altona in the Great War of Separation number 2 comes at the very beginning of the book, where she's playing with the dog and not paying any attention to her mother and brother, who aren't exhibiting any powers at the time anyway. So the only time we've ever seen any instance of either Harriet or Avery concealing their powers is in this single scene from the Great War of Separation number 1, which means that in order to make this connection between this particular dialogue and the editor's note correct, we would need to change the editor's note to reference issue number 1 rather than issue number 2. At least that's one possible fix, because the real problem might be that the referencing asterisk is in the wrong place. But if that's the case, what dialogue should we be linking the editor's note to? There's no useful information in this dialogue balloon, so it can't be here. That leaves the top dialogue balloon, from which we learn two things. First, Avery peaked at an earlier age than Harriet did, and second, Avery is capable of doing more exceptional things than Harriet is. But are either of these factoids actually depicted in The Great War of Separation number 2? We'll have to go look. You might recall that in my final review on The Great War of Separation number 2, titled Who Wrote This?, I describe how in the latter portion of the book, the United States of America fired missiles into Texas containing armored accepts. And there's a side thread in the book in which young Avery Stillman and a friend are chased and threatened by one of these armored accepts. It's this side thread that presumably is going to connect with the editor's note from ISOM number 3, so let's dive in. We start off with Harriet Stillman spotting her son Avery and his friend going after one of the missiles that landed. Harriet immediately goes after them, but not soon enough to keep them from encountering and being chased by the armored accept that emerged from inside the missile. The fleeing boys run smack into Harriet, and Harriet strides off to confront the accept. When Avery's friend asks what's going on, Avery says he doesn't know. The friend wisely hightails it, but Avery decides to stick around and see what happens. Of course, anyone with a brain, and especially anyone who's read ISOM number 3, knows that Harriet is about to go mano a mano with the armored accept. And she holds her own pretty well until the accept smashes a car down on her and triggers young Avery to attack the accept himself to save his mom. Note that this scene of Avery apparently manifesting his powers for the first time would make a particularly badass splash page, same as this scene of Avery's mom manifesting her powers to us for the first time in ISOM number 3 also would have made a great splash page. Unfortunately, just as the scene of Avery's mom gets shrunken and buried so that it loses most of its impact, so too does this primo scene of young Avery on the attack get shrunken and muted by the surrounding panels. I honestly wonder who it is that doesn't understand how to maximize the impact of scenes like this. Is this Jack Herbert's problem? Is it Chuck Dixon's? Eric July's? Rippaverse editorials? It shouldn't be brain surgery to see that scenes like this should be splash pages for maximum effect. Not even the next page's scene of Avery's giving the attacking accept a good whack in the face compensates for how lackluster the presentation of Avery's powers is overall, especially since his little boy accept strength doesn't appear to really faze the attacking accept much. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details of how Avery's intervention gives his mother time to rebound and defeat the attacking accept. Suffice it to say, that's what happens, and here we have the two of them checking on each other and congratulating each other on a job well done. With that, the scene concludes, which means it's time to go back to ISOM number 3 and see how well that scene from The Great War of Separation number 2 corresponds with this editor's note. Remember that the dialogue referenced by the editor's note has two parts. The second part, which we'll look at first, says that Avery is capable of doing things that Harriet isn't. Is that what we see in the scene? Avery doing things his mom can't? No, we see him demonstrating strength and resilience, same as her. So obviously it isn't the second part of what Harriet's saying here that ties in with the editor's note. Rather, it has to be the first part about how Avery peaked at an earlier age, meaning that the scene we just witnessed in The Great War of Separation number 2 was the first time Avery ever manifested his powers. But is that true either? Under the influence of the editor's note from ISOM number 3, I consciously read this scene through the frame that Avery was manifesting his abilities for the first time ever here. I basically led myself to believe, because of the editor's note, that Avery here has no idea that either his mom or that he himself has powers, and that it's both the shock of learning his mother has powers plus seeing her life endangered that causes him to manifest his powers for the first time. But if you throw away that editor's note and just read the scene as is, there's plenty of reason to believe Avery's manifesting his powers for the first time is not what happens here. Note first that Avery does not demonstrate any real concern for his mother's safety. She's walking up to a mechanized monstrosity that can shoot laser death beams from its eyes, and instead of crying out to his mom, "What are you doing? Mom, he's going to kill you!" all Avery really does is break out the popcorn and settle in to watch. Likewise, after Avery's seen his mom in action, we don't see him questioning whether he, being her son, might have powers of his own. Instead, he just leaps into the fray and starts beating on the attacking accept as if he knew all along he was capable of doing that. Lastly, when the battle is over and Harriet and Avery have a chance to talk about what happened, there's no mention between them of anything like, "Mom, you're an accept," or, "Well, son, I guess you have the same powers I do." Neither of them expresses any surprise. In other words, how the characters conduct themselves throughout this scene predominantly leads one to believe that this is not the first time that Avery has ever seen his mother display powers, nor is this the first time that Avery himself has displayed powers in his mother's presence. Instead, the most reasonable interpretation of this scene is that Harriet and Avery have been aware of each other's abilities for some time, which means Avery's first manifestation of his powers occurred sometime before this battle, maybe even before the beginning of the issue, and maybe even before the beginning of the first issue of the Great War of Separation. And if that interpretation is correct, then this first portion of Harriet's dialogue doesn't correspond with the Great War of Separation number 2 either, as Avery did not peak in that issue, but instead peaked well before that issue in some scene we have yet to be shown. So that means there's no dialogue in this entire panel that accurately links up with the editor's note, so this editor's note shouldn't be there at all. This editor's note is completely inaccurate and should have been left out entirely. In case you're tempted to say, oh, come on, Mike, where's the harm? I've already shown you the harm. The harm is that reading this editor's note in ISOM number 3 is going to prime you to think that the Great War of Separation number 2 is where Avery manifested his powers for the first time, and it really wasn't. That editor's note only serves to mislead readers. Of course, I am assuming that I'm correct in interpreting this scene as showing us that Harriet and Avery have been well aware for some time that they're both Excepts. But is it possible that I'm wrong about that? Could it be that this actually was Avery's first time manifesting his powers, so that this editor's note and dialogue linkage are actually correct? I really don't think so, because that would mean Chuck Dixon has become such a shit writer over the decades since his Batman days that he doesn't even know anymore to throw in dialogue showing how surprised each character should be at what the other character can do, and in Avery's case, at what he himself can do. I don't believe for a moment that Chuck Dixon is that shitty of a writer. So I'm going to stick to my guns and maintain that this editor's note is invalid and never should have been printed in ISOM number 3, because Harriet and Avery have known about their powers all along at this point. By the way, this interpretation actually serves to improve this sappy, sterile scene from the Great War of Separation number 1, in which at first it appears like Avery's grin in the third panel is just a hit-you-over-the-head obvious display of the joy he feels at having a married mother and father who clearly love each other. It makes for a nice sentiment, but it also makes the scene absolute shit for being so saccharine and drama-free. But if you view that scene instead through the lens of Avery's being well aware that his mother has powers, then you realize Avery is grinning not because he's so happy to have married, loving parents, but rather because he knows his mother is only fooling his dad into thinking she needs help opening the pickle jar. The little shit's in on the joke. He's smiling at the charade his mom is playing for his dad's sake. Of course, the reader can't fully understand this at first reading without knowing both about Harriet's powers and Avery's knowledge of those powers, but the fact that this scene might have more layers than it originally seemed actually brings up another question. Just what is the correct reading order of these 3 books? I mean, this is the order in which I got the books in the mail, so I just assumed this is the order in which I should read the books, but now I'm not so sure. After all, if you read the Great War of Separation number 1 before you read ISOM number 3, then you won't know in this scene that Harriet has powers, so you'll think her need for a pickle opener is genuine and that Avery's shit-eating grin is the result of married parent privilege, and this whole scene will end up seeming ridiculously saccharine and shallow. On the other hand, if you read ISOM number 3 before the Great War of Separation number 1 so that you learn about Harriet's powers first, then this scene at least takes on a little bit of complicated layering in that, okay, Avery thinks he's seeing a husband and wife acting as a typical husband and wife should, but we readers know that Harriet is actually playing a joke on Jacob, so we might actually feel kind of bad for Avery that he's being conned right along with Jacob, at least until we find out in the Great War of Separation number 2 that Avery is also in on the con. This reading order also fits better with the fix proposed earlier of making the editor's note refer to the Great War of Separation number 1 instead of number 2. But considering that ISOM number 3 came out almost 2 months after the Great War of Separation number 1, it's kind of impossible to think that this reading order could be valid. So I'm thinking this order of actual delivery is still the correct reading order so far. But we still have to consider whether ISOM number 3 is supposed to be read before the Great War of Separation number 2, because this isn't obvious either, especially when you look back at the campaign pages and realize that ISOM number 3's pre-order campaign closed over a full week after the pre-order campaign for the Great War of Separation number 2, meaning that if we go by campaign close dates, this was the order we should have received the books in, which places the Great War of Separation number 2 in our hands before ISOM number 3. That's problematic in the extreme, because if you read the Great War of Separation number 2 and find out from that book that Harriet has powers, then you're not going to be worried at all when you see Harriet get cracked over the head with a chair in ISOM number 3, because you know she's going to be just fine and, in fact, will likely unleash her world of hurt on Darren's goons. Any sense of surprise in ISOM number 3 would be spoiled entirely. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but what I've heard through the grapevine is that the duplicative printing error found in all the double-page spreads of Zaylin What Kills Must Die caused a delay in the distribution of the Great War of Separation number 2, as Rippaverse had to find a new printing company. That caused the delivery date of the Great War of Separation number 2 to be pushed out beyond ISOM number 3's delivery date, so that this original order of delivery got changed to the order of delivery we actually experienced in the real world. But if that's true, the only reason Rippaverse didn't fuck the readers in the ass with spoilers for ISOM number 3 is because they fucked up proofing another book entirely unrelated to any of the 3 books in question. That's just dumb luck. What you really want to do in situations like this is write your books in such a way that you can read them in either order without spoiling any surprises. For example, in ISOM number 3, you reveal that Harriet Silman has powers. But in the Great War of Separation number 2, you keep Harriet's powers concealed. Instead, have your side thread be all about how young Avery manifests his powers for the first time to save his young friend from the armored Accept, to the absolute shock of his mother. By letting each book surprise the reader in its own way with its own revelations, you don't have to worry about reading order at all. It's through that kind of foresight and planning, not through an accidental printing error that winds up unexpectedly saving your ass, that you will come to understand how to keep peak shock value. Thank you for watching. If you found the information in this video helpful, please hit like and also hit hype if you see that option available. That's a new function YouTube is just now rolling out that helps expand a video's reach. Additionally, you should subscribe if you haven't already so that you will be notified of my future review videos. We're not done with ISOM number 3 yet, so expect more review videos to come shortly. Also, please be aware I'm currently raising funds to review the long-awaited SUPERKILLER, written by the biggest problem in the universe's Vito Gesualdi. Only $60 needed to purchase 2 copies of SUPERKILLER, one as a reading copy and the other to carve up for scans. Vito's a comedian, so let's see if this book truly kills. I'm Mike Partika. Once again, thank you for watching, and I will talk to you later.